You're lying in bed on a cold winter evening in Tudor England, somewhere around the year 1500. Outside, the wind howls through the narrow streets of London, and you can hear the distant sound of night watchmen calling out the hour. As your eyes grow heavy, your mind begins to wander to a question that might seem strange at first, but think about it for a moment. How did people manage their waste, their filth, their most intimate and embarrassing moments in a time before toilets, before plumbing, before anything resembling the sanitary systems we take for granted today? More specifically, imagine a profession so reviled, so utterly despised, that it had to be conducted entirely under the cover of darkness. A job so unpleasant that the people who did it were often attacked, robbed, and treated as social pariahs. Yet without them, entire cities would have drowned in their own waste. These workers were called Gong Farmers, though you might also hear them referred to by other names. Some called them Nightmen. Others used the term Gong Fayers or Gong Scourers. All of these names pointed to the same basic truth: they were the invisible workers who kept medieval and Tudor England from suffocating under the weight of its own bodily waste. If you enjoy this kind of detailed, immersive, historical storytelling, I'd really appreciate it if you would take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I read every single comment, and I'd love to know what draws you to these forgotten stories. Maybe it's the historical detail, or perhaps it's just the unique atmosphere we create together. Whatever it is, let me know. Now, let me set the scene for you properly. We're in England during the Tudor period, somewhere between the late 1500s and early 1600s. But really, gong farmers existed for centuries before this, stretching back further into the medieval past. The profession emerges from a simple, unavoidable fact of urban life. Cities grow, populations concentrate, and suddenly there's far too much human waste to manage through simple, natural means. In London, the problem became acute sometime in the late 1400s. The city had grown into a thriving commercial center with perhaps 30,000 souls crammed into a space that today might comfortably hold a few 100,000. Every building had its privy, its toilet, by whatever name you called it. The great halls of nobles had them. The homes of merchants had them. Even the poorest neighborhoods had their shared facilities, crude though they might be. But here's where the problem emerged. You see, these privies weren't connected to anything resembling a sewer system. Each one was essentially a hole, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes reinforced with wood, but fundamentally a hole in the ground that led to a cesspit beneath the building. When rain fell, it would percolate down through the soil and gradually drain away the liquid waste, leaving only the solids to accumulate. This process, which might have worked reasonably well with a small population in a rural setting, became catastrophic in a crowded city. Every 2 years or so, the solids would build up to the point where the cesspit became completely full. At that point, the cesspit would no longer accept any new waste. The toilet above would back up. The smell would become absolutely unbearable, not just an unpleasant odor, but a miasma so thick and so powerful that it could make you physically ill. And here's another complication that many people don't fully appreciate. Medieval people actually understood, on some level, that bad air, what they called miasma, could spread disease. They weren't entirely wrong about this, though their understanding of the mechanism was incomplete. They correctly intuited that somewhere in all that filth and decay, something dangerous was at work. So the accumulation of waste wasn't just a nuisance, it was a genuine public health crisis. This is where the gong farmer enters the picture. The word gong itself comes from Old English. It derives from a word that meant to go, but it had evolved to refer both to the toilet itself and to the waste within it. You might hear someone in medieval London say something like, "The gong needs emptying," or the gongs overflowing. It was crude slang, understood by everyone, but it marked the conceptual boundary between the refined language of the nobility and the practical, direct language of those who dealt with the city's most essential problems. The Gong Farmer's job, at its most basic level, was to physically remove this accumulated waste from beneath the privies and transport it to designated dumping grounds outside the city walls. But as we'll explore in much more detail as this story unfolds, the reality was far more complex, far more harrowing, and far more essential than this simple description suggests. What makes the Gong Farmer's story so compelling, though what makes it the kind of story worth spending hours telling as you drift towards sleep, is that it reveals something profound about medieval and early modern society. On the surface, it's just the story of a person doing a job that nobody else wanted to do. But if you look deeper, you see something much more interesting. You see a person navigating a world of rigid social hierarchies, occupational hazards that could kill you, and a kind of work that forces you into the margins of respectable society. Yet somehow, these workers were essential, valued at least economically, and even in their way, respected. Think about your own relationship with sanitation for a moment. You probably give very little thought to where your waste goes. You flush a toilet, and it disappears. End of story. But your disconnection from that process is actually a luxury, a recent luxury in human history. The Gong Farmer's story reminds us that this luxury exists only because, for centuries, there were people willing to do this filthy, dangerous, despised work. So settle in. This is going to take us on a journey through the nighttime streets of medieval London, down into the darkness of cesspits, through the sensory experiences of a world utterly alien to our own. And by the time we're finished, I think you'll have a much richer understanding of what daily life was actually like for ordinary people in the past, and a grudging respect for the workers who kept the city standing. Let's begin, where every story about gong farmers must begin with the environment they inhabited. To understand what it was like to be a gong farmer, you first need to understand what London or any major English city actually looked and sounded and smelled like during the Tudor period. And I want you to really picture this, because your first instinct will be to imagine something almost cartoonishly filthy and terrible. But the reality was stranger and more complex than that simple narrative. Let's start with what you would have seen if you'd walked through the streets of London in the year 1500. The city itself was a maze of narrow streets, most of them no wider than what we might call an alley today. The buildings pressed in close on either side, timber-framed structures, with the upper stories often jutting out over the lower ones, so that the street below existed in a kind of perpetual half-light. The walls were painted or lime-washed in various colors, whites, yellows, reddish-browns, but many of these colors would have been stained and darkened by decades of wood smoke and urban grime. The streets themselves were unpaved. They were simply packed earth, rutted by cartwheels and animal hooves, and constantly muddy or dusty, depending on the weather. In some areas, particular streets might be partially paved with rough stone, but this was rare. The effect would have been something like walking through a gigantic farmyard that had somehow sprouted buildings and people. Everywhere you looked, there were animals. Pigs rooted freely in the streets, scavenging for food. Chickens pecked at the ground. Horses and mules were constantly being led through the streets, laden with goods, and all of these animals left their waste behind, adding yet another layer of filth and odor to the general chaos. The light, as I mentioned, was dim. Even during the day, the overhang of the buildings and the narrow gap of sky above meant that the streets existed in a kind of twilight. And of course, at night, when our gong farmer would have been working, the darkness would have been almost absolute. There would have been a few flickering candles and lanterns, visible through the windows of buildings where people still kept fires burning. But otherwise, the night was genuinely dark in a way that's almost impossible for modern people to imagine. The Gong Farmer would have relied on candlelight, on moonlight when it was available, and on an intimate familiarity with the streets from countless previous nights of work. Now, the smell. This is where we need to be honest, without being melodramatic. Yes, medieval cities smelled bad, but they didn't smell bad in the way that a neglected toilet in a single house might smell bad today. They smelled bad in a way that was almost overwhelming to the senses, a complex, layered assault on the nose that would have seemed to penetrate your entire body. The primary source was, of course, human and animal waste. This smell permeated everything, but it was most concentrated in certain areas near the markets where animals were slaughtered, near the public latrines, near the cesspits and dunghills. In other areas, the smell was less overwhelming, but never entirely absent. It was just there, always, a kind of background hum of filth that your nose would eventually become somewhat adjusted to, even if you never really stopped noticing it. But there were other smells as well. Wood smoke was everywhere from the chimneys of thousands of buildings, from blacksmith shops and bakeries and dyers' workshops. This smoke mingled with the smell of waste to create a kind of acrid, stinging atmosphere that would have made your eyes water when it was particularly thick. There were also organic smells, the smell of stored food, of rotting vegetables, of fish that had gone bad. In the markets, there would have been the smell of fresh meat and fresh fish, pungent and strong. In the poorer areas, there would have been the smell of fermenting beer or ale, because beer was the drink of choice for all classes, and the brewing process creates distinctive aromas. Underneath all of this, or perhaps better described as threading through all of it, was the smell of human bodies. People bathed very infrequently in this period. Contrary to popular misconception, they weren't entirely ignorant of hygiene, but they had very different practices. They would wash their hands and faces regularly, sometimes with perfumed water if they were wealthy. They would change their underclothes relatively frequently, because it was believed that clean linen next to the skin was the primary defense against disease. They would use herbs and perfumes to mask odors, but a full-body bath? That was rare. For wealthy people, perhaps once a month. For ordinary people, perhaps a few times a year. The result was that the human smell, the smell of sweat and skin oil and other bodily secretions, was a constant presence in any crowded space. Now let's talk about the sound environment. Medieval cities were actually quieter than modern cities in some ways, but this didn't mean they were quiet. They were different kinds of loud. There were no cars, no mechanical noises, but there were constantly the sounds of human activity. Market vendors would be shouting to advertise their wares. Blacksmiths would be hammering on metal. Carpenters would be sawing and hammering wood. Animals would be making noise, horses neighing, pigs squealing, chickens clucking. Cartwheels would be rattling over the rough ground. And then there were the sounds of water fountains and wells, the sound of water being poured or splashed. Rain, when it came, would create a kind of rushing noise as it funneled through gutters and downspouts and ran off into the streets. At night, when the Gong Farmer was working, many of these sounds would be muted, but the city wouldn't be quiet. You'd hear the sounds of night activities, the watch making their rounds, calling out the time, occasional voices from buildings, the sound of the wind moving through the narrow streets and between the buildings. As for the touch and the physical environment, imagine the cold. Medieval London was cold, particularly in the winter. The wind would come whipping through the narrow streets, and it would cut right through your clothing. The moisture would be perpetual. Even on days that weren't actively rainy, there would be moisture in the air, a kind of damp chill that would penetrate into your bones. The surfaces you'd touch would be varied. Rough stone walls, often damp with moisture. Smooth wooden surfaces, worn by countless hands, mud that would stick to your boots. The edges of tools, worn smooth by use. The texture of your own clothing, rough wool and linen, stiff from dried sweat and dirt. This was the world the Gong Farmer inhabited. This was the sensory environment of medieval waste management work. And now that you've settled into this world a little bit, now that you can almost hear the echo of footsteps on the packed earth and smell the mingled scents of the medieval city, we need to move deeper into the night. We need to follow the Gong Farmer down into the cesspit. The work of a Gong Farmer typically began around 9 in the evening, though the exact time could vary depending on regulations and the preferences of the city authorities. Let's imagine yourself in this role, because that's how we've been framing this entire story. From your perspective, you're gathering your tools for the night's work. What do you have with you? The basic equipment is surprisingly minimal. You have a shovel or spade wooden handled with a blade of iron or steel. You have buckets, usually wooden and quite large, probably capable of holding several gallons of waste. You have a rope or a series of ropes, perhaps as long as 20 or 30 feet, because the cesspits were often quite deep, and you'd need a way to lower the buckets down and haul them back up. If you're working alone, you might have a lever or a kind of primitive crane arrangement that would help you move the buckets more efficiently. Depending on the size of the cesspit and the amount of work involved, you might be working with a team. The most common arrangement was 3 or 4 men, one in the pit doing the actual digging and shoveling, 1 or 2 hauling the buckets up using the rope, and possibly 1 transporting the buckets to the cart or the larger dumping area. You put on your worst clothing, the garments you wouldn't mind destroying. For most Gong Farmers, these weren't particularly different from the clothing they wore during the day, just more worn and stained. You might tie cloth around your face or your nose, trying to create some barrier against the smell. You might have a lantern or a candle, though you'd need to be careful with flame, because the gases that accumulated in a cesspit could occasionally ignite. Let me take you down into a typical cesspit excavation. To do this, I need you to really engage your senses as I describe this, because understanding the physical reality of this work is essential to understanding both why Gong Farmers were both necessary and despised. The cesspit that needs emptying might be accessed through a trapdoor or through a purpose-built opening in the ground. It's a hole, perhaps 6 or 8 feet square, and it descends down into the earth maybe 10 or 15 feet deep, sometimes deeper. The walls, when you first glimpse them, are lined with stone or brick, though they're so coated with years of accumulated waste and slime that you can barely see the underlying structure. As you approach the opening, the smell hits you like a physical blow. It's not like any smell you've encountered before. It's a compound of human waste, decomposing food, and putrefying organic matter of every kind. It's thick and heavy, and it seems to cling to your clothing and your skin and even your hair. Your eyes begin to water almost immediately. Some workers described it as literally sickening, and that's not exaggeration. The smell alone could induce nausea or vomiting in workers not accustomed to it, even with years of experience. Beneath the surface of the waste, there's a kind of sludge, a partially decomposed mixture of everything that's accumulated over the past 2 years. Near the edges of the pit, where the liquid has drained away, this material is almost dry and crumbly. Closer to the center, it's thicker, more solid, sometimes almost concrete-like, and beneath all of that, there's liquid the seepage from all the decomposing material, stinking and dark. The wooden chutes that once carried waste down into the pit from the toilets above might still be visible, caked with layers of buildup. Sometimes, a chute becomes completely blocked, and the Gong Farmer's job includes clearing this blockage, which means crawling up into the narrow wooden channel and scraping away the accumulated waste. It's claustrophobic, dark, and the smell is somehow even more concentrated in these tight spaces. Now, the worker, perhaps you yourself, has to descend into this pit. You lower yourself down carefully, either on a rope or by some kind of ladder arrangement. As your head goes below the level of the ground, the smell intensifies dramatically. It's not just a smell now, it's something you're essentially immersing yourself in. The air itself seems contaminated, thick, almost visible. The work itself is physically grueling. With your shovel or spade, you begin scraping at the accumulated waste, breaking it up into manageable pieces. Some of it is relatively solid. You can scoop it up with relative ease. Other parts are semi-solid or liquid, and these have to be handled more carefully, often scooped into buckets using a kind of flat shovel or scraper. The bucket fills with waste. You call up your partners. They haul the bucket up using the rope. The bucket emerges from the pit, and now someone else has the job of either carrying it to a cart or transferring it to a larger container for transport. The smell follows the bucket. It's almost as if you're creating a trail of odor through the streets of the city. Meanwhile, you go back to work. The physical labor is intense. You're constantly digging, scooping, moving. Your back aches. Your legs ache. Your hands begin to blister against the handle of your shovel, despite any wrapping or protection you've put on them. The waste is slippery, and you lose your footing occasionally, catching yourself against the slimy walls of the pit, and the smell never stops assaulting your senses. Your nose adapts to some degree. After an hour or so, you're no longer as acutely aware of it, but it's still there, still penetrating into your lungs with every breath. If you've eaten anything, your stomach may rebel. Some workers learn not to eat before or during their shift, trying to minimize the risk of vomiting into the very pit they were working in. Beyond the simple physical difficulty, there are dangers you need to be aware of. The decomposition of organic matter produces gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. These gases accumulate in the cesspit, and they're dangerous. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic, and exposure to high concentrations can cause serious illness or even death. Methane is flammable, and if there's any spark or flame, if someone's candle or torch ignites the gas, there could be an explosion. There are also the dangers of drowning. If you slip and fall into the liquid portion of the pit, the depth and the slickness of the walls make it very difficult to climb out. People have died this way, pulled down into the very waste they were trying to remove. And then there are the diseases. Working with raw human sewage means constant exposure to pathogens of every kind. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, all of these diseases could be transmitted through the contaminated waste. The Gong farmers would have had no understanding of germ theory, but they would have known empirically that this work was dangerous. Many Gong farmers became ill regularly. Some died from their work-related illnesses. All of this happens in near total darkness, illuminated only by the flickering light of a candle or the moonlight filtering down from above. All of this happens in silence, or near silence, broken only by the sounds of digging and scooping and the occasional instruction being called between workers. Yet there's a rhythm to it, a kind of meditation, almost once you get past the initial horror of it. Dig, scoop, call out, haul up, repeat, hour after hour, through the night, until the cesspit is emptied. By the time the work is done, which could be a single night's work for a partial cleaning or several nights of work for a complete excavation, you're exhausted. Every muscle aches. Your clothes are soaked with sweat and contamination. The smell has become so much a part of you that you're not sure it will ever leave. And now we have to consider what happens once the waste leaves the cesspit. In modern society, we have an interesting relationship with workers in undesirable professions. We recognize their necessity, at least intellectually. We might even acknowledge that they deserve respect. But there's often an undertone of disgust, a certain social distance that's maintained. In medieval and Tudor England, this dynamic was far more pronounced and far more formalized. The Gong Farmer occupied a specific and quite low position in the social hierarchy. But the relationship between the Gong Farmer and society was more complex than simple disgust or dismissal. Let's think about the economic reality first. In the late 1500s, a Gong Farmer might charge 2 shillings per ton of waste removed. To give you a sense of what this means in economic terms, 2 shillings was a significant sum. It represented several days' wages for an ordinary laborer. So the Gong Farmer wasn't poor, at least not in comparison to the absolute poorest people in society. In fact, the job could be quite lucrative if you were willing to take it on regularly. This created an interesting situation. The Gong Farmer was economically valuable. People literally needed their services, and they had to pay for those services. Yet at the same time, the nature of the work created a profound social stigma. Think about the regulations that governed Gong Farmers' work. They weren't allowed to work during the day. The law specifically forbade it. Why? One reason was practical. The smell and the disturbance would have been intolerable during business hours. But there was another reason as well, and it's more social than practical. By restricting the work to nighttime, society was literally pushing the Gong Farmers to the margins. They were invisible during the day, not visible on the streets during normal business hours, not bringing their contaminating presence into the realm of respectable people's daily lives. Local ordinances in London and other cities were quite specific. The Gong Farmer had to carry his waste outside the city boundaries. He had to dispose of it in designated dumping grounds. He couldn't just dump it anywhere. There were regulations, fines, punishments for violations. This suggests that the work, while necessary, was also carefully controlled and managed. There was also a social dimension to this. The Gong Farmer's work marked him in a way that was almost impossible to escape. No matter how much he washed, no matter what he did, the smell clung to him. Fellow workers on other jobs would have immediately identified him as a Gong Farmer. Potential romantic partners would have recoiled from him. Respectable people would have avoided him in social situations. And yet, and this is important, there's evidence that Gong Farmers, at least to some degree, occupied a recognized position in society. They had a specific professional role. They had standards and practices. There are records of cities hiring Gong Farmers regularly, even contracting with specific individuals or groups to handle the waste management for particular districts. In some cases, Gong Farmers were appointed officially by city authorities. They might even have worn some kind of badge or insignia indicating their role. This wasn't necessarily a mark of honor, but it was a mark of official recognition. You were the Gong Farmer. It was your job. It was what you did. The relationship between the Gong Farmer and the property owner was also interesting. If you owned property and your cesspit needed emptying, you had to negotiate with a Gong Farmer. The Gong Farmer had some power in this relationship. They knew that you needed their services, and their skill or willingness to do the work couldn't easily be replaced. This might have led to conflicts. There are anecdotal reports of Gong Farmers being attacked or robbed. The nature of their work meant they were often alone at night, carrying valuable loads of waste that could be sold to farmers for use as fertilizer. The fact that Gong Farmers could sell their waste product to farmers suggests something important about the economic and agricultural system of the period. Human waste, night soil, as it was called, was valuable. It was an excellent fertilizer for crops. So the Gong Farmer wasn't just removing unwanted material, he was actually converting waste into a commodity that could be sold. This suggests that Gong Farmers might have had some relationship with farmers in the countryside. They would transport the waste outside the city, and then either sell it directly to farmers or dump it in a designated area where farmers could come and collect it. This was a genuine form of recycling, in its way converting urban waste into agricultural input. But here's where we see the complexity of medieval and Tudor social hierarchy most clearly. Even though the Gong Farmer was performing an essential economic function, even though they were being paid reasonably well, even though they were part of a formal system of waste management, they were still stigmatized. They were still marginal. They were still, in many ways, untouchable. I want you to imagine, for a moment, being a Gong Farmer in this social context. You're skilled at your work. You're paid reasonably well. Your essential cities literally cannot function without you. And yet, when you walk through the streets during the day, people avoid you. When you attempt to enter a shop or a public space, there might be hesitation, reluctance. If you're looking for a romantic partner, the stigma of your work would be a significant barrier. You'd likely marry someone from a similar background, another Gong Farmer's daughter, perhaps, or someone from another despised but necessary profession. This is the social reality of the Gong Farmer, respected economically, despised socially, necessary but marginal, visible in the official records and regulations of the city, but invisible in the day-to-day social fabric of respectability. And this is precisely why understanding the Gong Farmer matters. They reveal the true social structure of medieval and Tudor England, the difference between economic necessity and social status. They show us that every society needs people willing to do the dirty work, and that we've always found ways to both depend on and despise those people simultaneously. We need to now confront the darker realities of the Gong Farmer's work, the genuine dangers, the diseases, the ways in which this profession could literally kill you. Let's begin with the most immediate and dramatic danger: the gases produced by decomposing waste in a sealed or semi-sealed space. When organic matter breaks down in an anaerobic environment, that is, in an environment without oxygen, it produces several different gases. The most common are methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. Methane, you've probably heard of. It's a potent greenhouse gas, and it's flammable. In the context of a cesspit, an accumulation of methane could potentially ignite if exposed to an open flame. There are historical accounts of cesspits essentially exploding when a worker carrying a candle or torch descended into the pit and ignited the accumulated gas. These explosions could severely burn the worker or kill them outright. The stone or brick walls of the cesspit might crack or even collapse, potentially causing additional injuries. Hydrogen sulfide is perhaps more insidious. It's colorless but has a distinctive smell like rotten eggs. In low concentrations, it's merely unpleasant. But in higher concentrations, it's a genuine respiratory toxin. Prolonged exposure or exposure to high concentrations can cause serious pulmonary damage. Workers who spent extended periods in cesspits with high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide reported difficulty breathing, chest pain, and in severe cases, respiratory failure. The Gong Farmers would have had no way of knowing, scientifically, why they felt ill. They just knew that some days, some pits made them sicker than others. Carbon dioxide is another serious concern. In high concentrations, it can displace oxygen and lead to asphyxiation. A worker descending into a pit with high carbon dioxide levels might experience dizziness, confusion, and eventually loss of consciousness. There are historical records of workers who descended into cesspits and simply didn't come back up. They lost consciousness and drowned in the waste they were trying to remove. Then there's the matter of disease, the pathogens that inhabited the waste and could spread infection. In this era, people had no understanding of germ theory. They didn't know that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms. They understood disease through a concept called miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air or corrupted humors. They were, in a sense, half right. The bad air, they were concerned about the fetid, stinking air of a cesspit did indeed contain disease organisms. They just didn't know it. A Gong farmer working with human waste was in constant contact with pathogens. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, all of these diseases are transmitted through fecal matter, many intestinal parasites as well. Any break in the skin, a cut, a scrape, a blister on the hands or feet could potentially allow infection to enter the body. Cuts were inevitable in this work. Handling sharp edges of tools, blisters forming from repetitive work with a shovel, the constant abrasion and moisture creating conditions where skin breaks down. Furthermore, Gong farmers would almost certainly have ingested contaminated material occasionally. A Gong farmer eating food with unwashed hands or water from a contaminated source would ingest harmful organisms. Over time, many Gong farmers probably suffered from chronic intestinal infections. There's also the risk of injuries from the work itself. The cesspits were slippery. A worker could easily lose their footing and fall into the waste. If they fell into the deeper, liquid portions, the difficulty of climbing back out combined with the sliminess of the walls and the weight of their clothing could lead to drowning. The work with tools and buckets and ropes was also hazardous. A bucket full of waste was extraordinarily heavy, probably weighing 50 or 75 pounds when full. If the rope holding it broke, or if it was dropped, it could strike a worker below. A dropped rope could entangle a worker. The repetitive strain of hauling buckets up from significant depths could cause injuries to the shoulders, back, and arms. And then there's the question of violence. As I mentioned earlier, Gong farmers were sometimes attacked or robbed. They worked alone or in small groups, at night, in the dark. They often traveled with carts laden with waste, which, while unpleasant, was actually valuable. Farmers wanted it for fertilizer. A group of thieves or criminals might see a Gong farmer's cart as a target. The Gong farmer might be physically assaulted, robbed of whatever payment they'd received, or even killed, but the most insidious danger might have been the psychological and neurological effects of chronic exposure to the environment. Modern research on night workers has shown that working nights has serious health consequences. The circadian rhythm, the body's internal clock, is disrupted. Sleep becomes difficult. Immune function is compromised. Mental health can suffer. A Gong farmer working night after night, sleeping during the day, never quite getting enough rest, would have experienced these effects. The chronic stress of doing dangerous, disgusting work, the social stigma, the physical toll, all of this would have worn on a person psychologically over time. How long could someone maintain this work? How long before the disease, the exhaustion, the danger became too much? We don't have clear records of the life expectancy of Gong farmers specifically, but given the hazards of the profession, it's reasonable to assume that many didn't do this work for more than a decade or two. Some might have transitioned to other work as they aged and became less capable of the physical strain. Others might have simply succumbed to disease or accident. The historical record does mention that some Gong farmers became quite wealthy. Presumably those who worked in major cities took on contracts for larger buildings or institutions and accumulated capital over time. But for the average Gong farmer, the work was probably a transitional job, something done for a period of years, driven by economic necessity, and then abandoned if other opportunities arose. This, then, is the true cost of the Gong farmer's work. It was a profession that demanded a significant toll in health, safety, and longevity. It was work that few people would willingly do, which is precisely why those who did it could command significant wages. But those wages came at a real cost, paid in risk, in suffering, in shortened lifespan. And yet, despite all of these dangers, despite all of these costs, gong farmers continued to do this work. Cities grew, waste accumulated, and night after night, in the darkness, workers descended into the cesspits to do the work that society needed done, even as society scorned them for doing it. What was it like, psychologically, to be a gong farmer? What was it like to inhabit a body, a social identity that was marked by this work? Let me try to get inside the mind of a gong farmer to understand how they might have experienced their profession and themselves. First, there would have been a process of adaptation. The first time you descended into a cesspit, you probably nearly vomited from the smell alone. The psychological shock of confronting human waste in its most concentrated, most offensive form would have been profound. You might have questioned your choices. You might have considered abandoning the work immediately. But if you stayed, if economic necessity kept you at this work, you would gradually adapt. Your nose would become less sensitive to the smell. You would develop techniques to manage the psychological impact. Maybe you'd tell yourself stories about it. Maybe you'd focus on the money you were earning. Maybe you'd develop a kind of grim humor about the work, using jokes and black comedy to distance yourself psychologically from what you were doing. Over time, weeks, months, years, you would internalize this work. It would become part of your identity. You wouldn't be just a man who did gong farming sometimes. You would be a gong farmer. That would be how you identified yourself, how you were identified by others. This identity would have various psychological effects. On the one hand, it might have given you a sense of purpose and competence. You were skilled at something. You were performing an essential service. You were part of the infrastructure that kept the city functioning. There's a kind of dignity in that, if you choose to see it that way. On the other hand, the stigma would have been internalized as shame. Even if you were paid well, even if you recognized the value of your work, society's disdain for it would have affected you. When people avoided you, when they wrinkled their noses at your approach, when they treated you as somehow contaminated or polluted, these reactions would have affected your sense of self-worth. There's an interesting psychological dynamic here that's worth exploring. Medieval and early modern society attributed moral qualities to smell. A person who smelled bad was understood to be morally deficient, spiritually polluted. The stench that clung to the gong farmer wasn't just a physical reality, it was a moral marker. The gong farmer was literally stinking, and therefore, in some sense, literally sinful. Of course, this is almost certainly not how gong farmers consciously understood it, but it would have been part of the cultural air they breathed. They would have absorbed these ideas just as everyone else did, and this would have created an internal conflict, the recognition of their own necessity, their own skill, set against the cultural understanding that they were somehow fundamentally contaminated. Then there's the question of family and social relationships. A gong farmer seeking to marry would have faced significant challenges. What respectable family would want their daughter to marry a gong farmer? The stigma would have extended to the worker's family. Children of gong farmers might have been treated poorly by other children. The wife of a gong farmer would herself be contaminated by association, no matter how clean she kept herself. Many gong farmers probably married within the profession. If not to other gong farmers, then to women from similar walks of life, women from families involved in other dirty or despised professions. Waste collectors, ditch diggers, slaughter workers, these were people at the margins of respectability, and it's likely that the gong farmer community intermarried and socialized with this broader class of necessary but despised workers. This would have created a kind of sub-community, a culture parallel to mainstream society, with its own values and norms. In this community, the gong farmer's work would have been understood differently. Here, it would have been ordinary, necessary, skilled. Here, the stigma attached to the work in broader society would have been irrelevant or actively rejected. Let me ask you to consider something for a moment. How does a person maintain their dignity and self-respect when society tells them that they are contaminated, that they are less than, that their work is beneath consideration? The answer, I think, is that they find or create alternative sources of validation. The Gong Farmer would have needed to locate sources of self-worth that were insulated from the shame society tried to attach to them. Perhaps it was the respect of their fellow workers. Perhaps it was their economic success, the material comfort they could purchase with their wages. Perhaps it was their family relationships, if those were positive. Perhaps it was religion and understanding that their work, however humble, was ultimately in service to the common good. Or perhaps, and this is the darker possibility, perhaps the internalization of the shame led to a kind of resignation. You're a gong farmer, that's what you are. You're contaminated, and there's no way out, so you might as well accept it. You make money, you survive, you do your work, you try not to think too hard about what society thinks of you. This is the psychological dimension of the Gong Farmer's experience, the internal work of maintaining a sense of self and dignity in the face of profound social stigma. It's an experience that many people throughout history have had to undertake in different contexts. But the Gong Farmer's version was perhaps especially acute because the work itself was so intimately connected to human waste, to the most basic and most shameful aspects of human bodily existence. And now, having descended into the pit, having explored the dangers and the social realities, it's time to emerge from the darkness and consider the broader context, the cultural meanings and practices that surrounded the Gong Farmer's work. Medieval and early modern people had distinct ideas about cleanliness and purity that shaped how they understood the Gong Farmer's work. Let me explore this cultural dimension. First, let's consider the concept of pollution. In medieval thinking, pollution wasn't just a physical state. It had moral and spiritual dimensions. Certain kinds of work or contact left a person spiritually defiled. The Gong Farmer, by working with human waste, occupied a space of ritual impurity similar to that occupied by other workers whose professions involved death or decay: the executioner, the tanner who worked with rotting animal skins, the person responsible for disposing of corpses. In some societies, this kind of ritual impurity was formalized through caste systems or other institutional structures. Medieval England didn't have quite the same level of formalization, but the concept was there's certain kinds of work polluted you, and that pollution couldn't easily be washed away. Yet here's where it becomes interesting. Despite this understanding, Gong Farmers continued to be employed, paid, and their services contracted regularly. This suggests that medieval and early modern society was sophisticated enough to recognize that, despite the spiritual pollution of the work was necessary. The city needed the Gong Farmers, and so arrangements had to be made to accommodate them while still maintaining the sense that they were somehow separate. This is why the work was restricted to nighttime. During the night, the boundaries between normal and abnormal, clean and polluted, respectable and despised, could be more flexibly managed. The Gong Farmer could do their work without violating the normal social order that prevailed during daylight hours. It's also why the waste had to be disposed of outside the city boundaries. The spatial boundaries of the city were understood as boundaries of civilization, cleanliness, and order. Beyond the boundaries were waste, nature, disorder. The Gong Farmer transported polluted material from inside these boundaries to outside them, maintaining the conceptual distinction between inside and outside, clean and unclean. Let's also consider the question of payment and economic compensation. The fact that gong farmers were paid relatively well for their work suggests something interesting about medieval and early modern society's values. They recognized that the work was undesirable. They understood that people wouldn't willingly do it for low wages, and so they paid more to compensate for the unpleasantness and danger of the work. This is actually a quite rational economic principle, and it's interesting that it was operating even in a society without modern economic theory. The gong farmers' wages represented a kind of compensation for the disutility of the work. You were paid extra precisely because the work was disgusting and dangerous. In some cases, payment might have taken unusual forms. There's a historical reference to a gong farmer to Elizabeth I being partly paid in brandy. This suggests a few things. First, that high-status individuals might employ gong farmers personally. Second, that payment might sometimes be negotiated in goods rather than pure currency. And third, perhaps, that alcohol was seen as a useful compensation for unpleasant work. Maybe the brandy was used to dull the senses, to make the work more tolerable. Now let's consider the question of skill and expertise. We often think of medieval society as entirely hierarchical, with very little opportunity for social mobility. But in reality, people with particular skills, and the gong farmer was a skilled worker, had a certain amount of leverage and status. A gong farmer wasn't just randomly assigned to empty cesspits. They had to know how to manage the physical labor involved, how to handle the hazards, how to deal with complicated situations. What happens if the cesspit hasn't been emptied in 5 years and has become completely solidified? What happens if there's a blockage in the chute that requires careful and strategic work to clear? What happens if you encounter something unexpected, a corpse, a valuable object, a structural weakness? The experienced gong farmer would have had answers to these questions. They would have developed techniques and strategies. They would have known how to work efficiently, how to manage their workers, and how to stay safe. This expertise would have given them a certain standing, at least among property owners who needed their services. There's also the question of how gong farmers understood their work culturally. The modern reader might assume that gong farmers saw their work purely negatively, as a necessary evil they had to engage in for economic reasons. But it's possible that some internalized a sense of dignity or purpose to the work. They were keeping the city clean. They were preventing disease and public health catastrophes. They were part of the urban infrastructure. Medieval and early modern society was very aware of the connection between waste management and public health, even without understanding germ theory. The authorities regulated gong farmers' work specifically because they understood that improper waste disposal led to disease and social disorder, and the gong farmers themselves would have been aware of this connection. They would have known that their work mattered, that without them, cities would face serious problems. Finally, let's consider the rituals and practices that might have surrounded gong farmers' work. Did they have particular routines, particular ways of managing the psychological impact? Did they have communities where they socialized together, shared experiences, supported each other? We have very little documentary evidence for this, but we can speculate. They probably did have professional associations or informal networks. They probably gathered in particular taverns or locations. They probably shared jokes, stories, and techniques. They probably had rituals of cleansing and purification when they finished their work, washing rituals that were both practical and psychological. All of this suggests that the gong farmer's work, while undoubtedly unpleasant and stigmatized, was also embedded in a broader cultural and social context that gave it meaning, that provided community and support, that created frameworks for understanding and managing the experience. And this cultural dimension is part of what makes the gong farmer's story so compelling and so worth understanding, because it reveals something about how societies manage the dirty, essential work that keeps them functioning. There are a few fascinating and somewhat unusual aspects of the Gong Farmer's profession that deserve attention. Consider, for instance, the defensive role that Gong Farmers sometimes played in castles. Yes, you read that correctly. In castle settings, the garderobe shoots the channels through which waste traveled from the toilets above to the pits below, sometimes became access points for attackers trying to infiltrate the castle. It was an unusual and desperate method of attack, but it occasionally happened. Enter the Gong Farmer with a weapon. One of the Gong Farmer's responsibilities when working in a castle was to be prepared to defend the chute from attack. If a would-be assailant attempted to climb up through the garderobe chute to gain entry to the castle, the Gong Farmer's job was to stop them. This might involve hitting them with a tool, dumping waste on them, or other defensive measures. Imagine the scenario for a moment. You're a Gong Farmer working in the depths of a castle, probably at night. You hear a sound, an unusual sound, coming from the garderobe chute above. You investigate cautiously, perhaps lighting your candle to see better, and then you realize someone is attempting to climb down through the chute to gain access to the castle from below. The person attempting this is already in a profoundly unpleasant situation. They're crawling through a chute that's covered in centuries of accumulated fecal matter and decay. They're moving through absolute darkness. They're already contaminated and disgusting, and now they have to contend with a Gong Farmer who's probably equipped with a shovel or other tool. It's both horrifying and darkly comic. The Gong Farmer, so despised and marginal in normal society, suddenly becomes a defender of the castle. The most reviled worker becomes a soldier. The cesspit becomes a battleground. This also connects to another interesting fact, that Gong Farmers sometimes found valuable items in the waste. People would accidentally drop things into the toilet. Coins, sometimes, jewelry, occasionally. Valuable items of all kinds. The Gong Farmer, digging through the waste, would encounter these items. Sometimes they were allowed to keep them, sometimes they had to return them. But the possibility of finding valuable items added another dimension to the work. Beyond the regular payment, there was the chance of finding treasure buried in the waste. Then there's the question of creativity in waste management. As cities faced increasing amounts of waste, and as the economics of waste disposal evolved, some Gong Farmers developed more innovative approaches. In some cases, they established larger dump sites where waste could accumulate and begin to decompose into a kind of manure-like substance that could be sold to farmers. In other cases, they found ways to process the waste, extracting materials, separating solids from liquids, and managing the decomposition process more systematically. By the Victorian era, this had evolved into a somewhat more sophisticated operation. The night soil men, the Victorian descendants of the medieval Gong Farmer, would collect waste and transport it to processing facilities where it could be treated, mixed with other organic materials, and converted into commercial fertilizers. But the roots of this system go back to the medieval Gong Farmer's basic innovation, recognizing that waste, properly managed and transported, could be converted into a valuable agricultural product. There's also an interesting etymological note. The term Gong Farmer has inspired considerable scholarly speculation. The most accepted explanation is that gong derives from the Old English word gan, meaning to go. So the Gong Farmer is literally a go farmer, someone who goes and removes the contents of the gong, the toilet. But there are alternative theories. Some scholars have suggested connections to Old Norse or other Germanic languages. The exact etymology remains somewhat uncertain, which is fitting for a profession so steeped in marginality and obscurity. Finally, let's consider the decline of the profession. As indoor plumbing became more widespread, and this process accelerated from the 16th century onward, the need for gong farmers gradually diminished. The gong farmer was a product of the particular technological regime of medieval and early modern urban life. As new technologies emerged that allowed waste to be managed differently, the profession became gradually less common. By the Victorian era, the profession still existed, but it was in its twilight. The development of water-based sewage systems, initially in major cities and gradually spreading to smaller towns, meant that the labor-intensive work of the night soil man was being replaced by what seemed like magic, transported through pipes and processed in distant treatment facilities. Yet this progress came with its own environmental problems, as these early sewage systems often simply discharged raw or partially treated waste directly into rivers and other water sources. In a sense, the problem wasn't solved, it was just moved elsewhere, out of sight and out of mind. But that's a story for another time. To fully appreciate the gong farmer's experience and the medieval waste management system, it's instructive to consider how other places and times managed the same essential problem. Let's begin with the ancient Romans. The Romans had a far more sophisticated approach to sewage and waste management than medieval England. They constructed extensive sewer systems, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, a massive underground channel that transported waste from throughout the city. These sewers connected to public latrines, which in turn connected to private facilities in wealthier homes. The Romans also used workers called aquarii, or watermen, to clean and maintain these sewage systems. These workers had a specific role in the urban infrastructure, and they were, in a sense, the Roman equivalent of the medieval gong farmer. But their work was somewhat different because the technological system was different. They weren't excavating cesspits. They were maintaining pipes, clearing blockages, managing the flow of water through the system. What's interesting is that despite the Romans' superior technology, these workers were still stigmatized to some degree. They were still necessary and despised. The technology didn't change the fundamental social dynamics of waste work. Now consider Victorian London, several centuries after our gong farmer's time. By the mid-19th century, London was a vastly larger and more complex city than medieval London. The waste management problem was exponentially greater. The night soil men of Victorian London were dealing with millions of people's waste, far more than any medieval gong farmer ever encountered. Yet their basic work was, in many ways, still quite similar. They worked at night. They transported waste outside the city. They were despised and stigmatized. They faced serious health hazards. The fundamental human problem, what do you do with your waste, remained largely unchanged. What had changed was the scale and, to some degree, the technology. Victorian night soil men sometimes had more sophisticated equipment carts with better wheels, mechanical devices to assist in hauling waste, even primitive processing facilities where waste could be treated and converted into commercial products. But the fundamental challenge remained. The waste couldn't simply disappear. Someone had to deal with it. And so the night soil men continued until the development of water-based sewage systems finally provided an alternative. Let's also consider how other medieval and early modern European cities managed this problem. In the Holy Roman Empire and in the Italian city-states, similar systems existed. Gong farmers or their equivalents worked under similar constraints, handled similar hazards, and occupied similar social positions. Some cities developed slightly different approaches. In Venice, the waste management problem was complicated by the fact that the city was built on water. Much of the waste was disposed of directly into the canals, creating a whole separate set of problems and a different class of workers responsible for maintaining the canals and dealing with accumulated waste in the water. In Paris, similar waste management systems to those in London developed, with workers sometimes called fossoyeurs or grave diggers, a telling equivalent, responsible for emptying cesspits. French workers faced similar regulations working at night, disposing of waste outside the city, maintaining specific standards of practice. What's remarkable is how consistent this pattern is across different cities and regions. The fundamental problem of urban waste management created remarkably similar solutions and remarkably similar social dynamics. The Gong Farmer of London had more in common with the night soilman of Victorian London, the Roman Aquarius, the Parisian fossoyeur, and the Gong Farmer of other English towns than any of them had with their respectable contemporaries who never had to touch human waste. This suggests something important about the nature of work and social hierarchy. Certain kinds of work, the essential, the dirty, the necessary, create a kind of separate social category. People in this category, across different cultures and time periods, share similar experiences. They're essential but despised. They're well paid but stigmatized. They work in darkness and concealment. They're both inside the city and fundamentally outside normal society. In our own time, we see this pattern continuing with sanitation workers, particularly in the global south, where waste management systems are less developed and more labor-intensive. Sanitation workers in parts of India, Africa, and South America face similar stigma, similar dangers, similar social marginalization to the medieval Gong Farmer, despite all the technological and social changes of the intervening centuries. This historical parallel suggests that the stigma attached to waste work is not simply a product of medieval superstition or ignorance. It persists even in modern, ostensibly more enlightened societies. It seems to be something deeper, something about human psychology and how we process the fact that our bodies produce waste and that someone has to deal with it. The Gong Farmer's story, then, is not just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror that reflects back to us something about our own society and our own often unacknowledged dependence on despised workers who handle the things we'd rather not think about. As we emerge from the dark streets of medieval London, from the depths of those cesspits, from the nighttime world of the Gong Farmer, let's reflect on what this extended exploration has revealed to us. The Gong Farmer was, in many ways, a paradox, simultaneously essential and invisible, valued economically while being scorned socially, skilled yet marginalized. This paradox tells us something profound about how human societies work, about the nature of necessary labor, about the gap between what we say we value and what we actually practice. The medieval and early modern city literally could not function without the Gong Farmer. If no one was willing or able to remove the accumulated waste from the cesspits, the waste would accumulate. The smell would become unbearable. Disease would spread unchecked. The city would become uninhabitable. And yet, even as this work was essential to the functioning of urban life, the people who did it were pushed to the margins. They worked at night. They couldn't openly display the signs of their profession. Their very presence in public space was seen as somehow contaminating. This reveals something interesting about human psychology and social organization. We tend to think of work as being hierarchically ordered, that important work is valued and respected, and unimportant work is devalued and despised. But the Gong Farmer's work challenges this assumption. Here was work that was, objectively, essential to human survival and well-being in cities, yet it was despised. The despising, I think, had less to do with the objective importance of the work and more to do with its intimate connection to human bodily waste. Humans have complex psychological relationships with their own waste. It's a reminder of our animal nature, our bodily needs, our mortality. We engage in elaborate rituals and systems to separate ourselves from our own waste. And anyone who has to handle other people's waste directly is confronted with what we'd rather forget, that all of us, regardless of status or wealth, produce waste. We're all bodily creatures with bodily needs. The Gong Farmer's work forced this confrontation. By their very existence, Gong Farmers reminded medieval and Tudor England that waste was real, that it had to go somewhere, that someone had to deal with it. And because this was uncomfortable to think about, that someone was pushed to the margins, made invisible, despised. I want you to imagine yourself, right now, accepting this reality. For a moment, feel gratitude toward those historical gong farmers, those night workers who, for centuries, did the dirty work that allowed cities to exist. Recognize that without them, without their willingness to do what no one else wanted to do, urban civilization would have been impossible. And then extend that recognition to the present. The sanitation workers of today, the sewage treatment facility workers, the waste disposal workers, these are the contemporary descendants of the medieval gong farmer. They're doing the same essential work, though often with better technology and in developed countries, better pay and working conditions. But the stigma often persists. The work is still often seen as beneath the notice of respectable people. Understanding the history of the gong farmer might, in a small way, help us develop a deeper gratitude for and recognition of the essential workers in our own time. We might recognize that work that involves human waste, or that's physically demanding, or that's unpleasant, doesn't somehow make the person doing it less worthy of respect. This is the quiet moral lesson embedded in the Gong Farmer's story, a reminder that every functioning society depends on people willing to do the work that no one else wants to do. And that recognition, that gratitude, that respect for necessary labor is something we might carry with us into our daily lives. So as you drift off to sleep, as the comfort of your modern sanitation systems cradles you, take a moment to think of the gong farmers. Think of the night soil, men working by candlelight, the workers loading foul-smelling carts, the ones who carried disease in their very occupation. Think of the humans who did this work, generation after generation, for centuries. And maybe tomorrow, when you flush your toilet and the waste disappears, you might have a slightly different appreciation for the marvels of modern sanitation. An appreciation informed by the knowledge of what came before, of how people managed these essential processes in earlier times, of what it took to keep medieval cities functioning. Sleep well. Tomorrow is another day, with its own necessities and its own invisible workers doing the work that allows civilization to continue. But tonight, rest, and dream, perhaps, of a world where all necessary work is honored, where we remember that society is built on the labor of people doing things that the rest of us would rather not think about. The story of the Gong Farmer is, ultimately, a story about human dignity and necessity, about the ways that society depends on its margin workers, about the gap between economic necessity and social status. It's a story that deserves to be remembered not just as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder of who keeps the world functioning. May the Gong Farmers of history rest well, having done their part for the cities they served. And may we, in our comfortable modern lives, never entirely forget them. Sleep well.